while we're setting that up, maybe we'll introduce ourselves. My name is Ryan Knox. I'm the managing director of SALAR International. And SALAR International is a subsidiary of the Swedish Local Government Association. We've worked for over 25 years in different countries, supporting local governance and decentralization, supporting sustainable urban planning, and many different aspects. Myself, I'm not an urban planner. I'm not an architect, but I've worked a lot with planning and a lot with architects in many different contexts, including my last job as the head of UN Habitat in Damascus, Syria, for the last 3 years until October last year. And I was lucky enough at the end of my assignment for the UN to go to Kiev and to Chernihiv and different places in Ukraine to help UN Habitat establish the beginnings of their program in the country. And then I returned to Stockholm, back to my old organization where we work, lucky enough to have the job that I have. And already I've returned to Ukraine again in February, where I went further east this time and went to Kharkiv region and was able to see firsthand the damage and destruction and also the resilience of the gramadas that we've been supporting for many years in Ukraine. So that's my little intro. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, my name is Helena Olsson, and I'm urban planner as a background. I'm currently at SALAR International as project manager and urban experts in our different projects related to urban development. I've also have a background within UN Habitat, but not in Syria. I've been in Afghanistan for a couple of years before I joined SALAR International, working with community-led development and reconstruction. Yes, I think that was my short introduction.
So we have quite a lot of ground to cover in this presentation. We're going to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing globally in the space of sustainable urban planning and recovery, but also what we've been doing in Ukraine and how we're thinking based on the last 6 months to a year's work of what sort of adjustment we can do to our long-standing cooperation with Ukraine that would focus on urban and urban recovery more. Maybe just to say a little bit, I'll come into this on subsequent slides, but that we've been working for 8 years in Ukraine. We've been mainly focusing on the support to accompany the decentralization reform, but also at the national level, but at the local level, administrative service provision, helping what you call in Ukraine with the establishment, modernization of SNAPs, the administrative service centers. We've been, with our teams in Ukraine, adjusting to the current context and making modifications to our work to help deal with emergency needs on the ground for the municipalities. And we've been trying to work with evidence-based for better planning, particularly on certain decentralized services like education with all the population displacement. So we're now in the discussion with the Swedish Embassy and SIDA about a new program of cooperation in Ukraine, which will follow our current work, which is really continuing the effort on decentralization, but also introducing a recovery component. There is also a discussion about bringing in Swedish municipalities in partnership with Ukrainian ones, which is very exciting. And I will add another thing we've been asked by the Swedish government recently, following a request from President Zelensky to the former Swedish Prime Minister that Sweden play a role in solid waste management, that we're now working with 4 Swedish authorities on developing a program on solid waste management policy at the national level and local level implementation. So there's a lot of things ongoing from our side. I didn't begin by thanking our colleagues from Swedish Architects and the Ukrainian Association. This is our second attendance in one of these events, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to discuss with you these things and to also look at building networks where we can tap into the expert base that you have both in Ukraine and Sweden. So maybe we go to, we're on the first slide, sorry. Okay, still. Yes, okay. So we've been reflecting on some key questions that we need to answer as we think about a new program, which is how could we build on our early experiences elsewhere in the world to support the urban sector in Ukraine? What does the global policy debate say about how to do effective post-conflict recovery? What is the role of local governments, or what should be the role of the local governments, the gramadas, in recovery and reconstruction in Ukraine, and what capacity needs to be built, and how are the experiences we have relevant for Ukraine, and what do we think about participatory local planning for recovery? So that's really there. I can change now by going like that. Excellent. This is just to give you our global strategy where we're working, the main lines of our work around in different countries. So we're supporting democratic systems. This is really about decentralization. We're supporting resilience and sustainability. This is where the urban resilience and planning and recovery aspect falls in. We're talking about rights and equality, inclusive service delivery, and then global responses, trying to influence the global agenda so that local government stays in focus when aid money is spent. So I'll pass to you now.
Work. Let's see. Switch. So maybe I just do it here. I don't know. Maybe he needs to do something on the. Yeah, I think it's maybe. Yes, so just a few words on our experiences within the urban sector during the last 10 years. So we've had a long-term collaboration with SIDA on inclusive urban development processes and support to around 20 cities in 8 countries for more specific development projects and activities, but also capacity development programs in over 15 countries. So that's what we have done during the last 10 years within this field. And what has been important elements of that work is both the coordination of two-way communication between Swedish municipalities and regions, of course, but also equivalent in the countries we work in. For mutual learning, of course, both what Swedish municipalities can learn, but also where Swedish municipalities can provide some knowledge support within different sectors. The perspective of holistic planning and development has been, of course, a crucial perspective. We are working through a methodology that maybe some of you know, some of you have already worked with it quite a lot, are experts in it. So the Symbio methodology, looking into sustainable urban development and how you actually methodological wise can support municipalities over a long-term period and through different planning projects to ensure that the sustainability and participation is there throughout the whole processes, looking also into gender perspectives, for example, and resilience. These projects have also been very much building on the existing assets, the local conditions, and contextual analysis has been a basis in all of them. So one thing that we also developed very much in the last stages of this global program was also different methodological perspectives and tools and projects to empower women and vulnerable groups in different societies. So this is just an overview of the work that we have done within the urban field, and the highlighted ones are these kind of larger urban development projects, support programs. We have also had, as I mentioned, a lot of capacity building programs, including in Ukraine, so-called international training programs. So Khmelnytsky, Lviv, and Ivano-Frankivsk has been part of these programs before. Yes, and I pass over.
So yeah, just a reflection on what's been happening in the global debate about how to do recovery after conflicts and natural disasters. In fact, there's been a lot of discussions, particularly with UN Habitat leading at World Urban Forums in the last 3 World Urban Forums, together with the World Bank and the EU. How do you do this in the best possible way? It's recognized that there are increasing numbers of natural or man-made disasters around the world, and that the response architecture is often inadequate. That means to say that it is often humanitarian approach, which is quite siloed and doesn't respond to the particular contextual needs of areas, cities, urban areas in particular. And even the reconstruction frameworks that follow often become quite siloed and sectoral, not multi-sectoral and area-based. There is a joint declaration signed by the EU, World Bank, and the UN in 2008, which tries to set the right framework for something called recovery and peace building assessments after conflicts, but also another framework for natural disasters. And UN Habitat has been pushing the urban recovery framework as a multi-sectoral, area-based, bottom-up, evidence-based approach to planning, engaging with local authorities and communities to get the approach right from the outset. And this is particularly came home in the last World Urban Forum in Katowice in Poland, which had a very, very big Ukraine focus and a big Ukrainian delegation. So I'm sure that that was influencing quite a lot of the discussions. We know that many of the actors that are doing the good work in Ukraine have already been involved in those conversations going back to June 2022. If we can go to next. So I just want to divert south of the Black Sea to Turkey to give you an example of something we're doing right now. We've been working in Turkey for 17 years. Most of the work we've been doing has been about how the municipalities in the last 5 years have been dealing with the pressure, population pressure of absorbing refugees from Syria. And we did a methodology which was about resilience assessments, how the municipalities managed to understand the continued provision of service when they faced with repeated shocks. First of all, it was population displacement, then it was the corona, and then it's the earthquake. So basically, we've seen the impact of the earthquake, and I won't go into these figures, but you've all seen the terrible images on the television, and I actually visited the area. It's quite catastrophic to see the level of damage from a natural disaster like this, with local governments out of sorts with how to deal with it, communities completely displaced, and even those cities dealing with up to 500,000 new population arriving near the earthquake area. So what we did is we tried to take with our urban planning team in Turkey the resilience assessment tool they developed for the population displacement and combine it with the urban profiling tool that UN Habitat often uses. And now we're working in the ground to we can even go to the next slide actually, in several different locations to understand social service provision as an entry point, because that's where refugees are, the services refugees mostly receive, but then also doing urban functionality analysis in two major cities, one that has been directly destroyed by the earthquake and the other that has received this 500,000 population increase. Two very different contexts, but both dealing with the need to continue provided services and make the economy function. And the idea we have is that in a country with a tendency for re-centralization, you've seen in the news the elections in Turkey recently, we are trying to make sure that the local governments continue to play their role. And they can only do that when they have the good evidence base. That means data collection has to happen local with communities. So we're helping with the data collection to identify where the gaps are and to develop a roadmap, which they can then use for fundraising for either through the central level or external financing to help with the recovery and reconstruction. Go on. So just to say what we've been doing in Ukraine, I did mention this last time we spoke, but I'm going to say it briefly. The national level, we've been supporting with the ministries, the parliament, parliamentary committee on local self-governance, and associations on the policy framework for decentralization. Others have been involved, but our work has focused specifically on the education sector, making sure that the transferred competence goes to gramadas and they manage the delivery of education well. Making sure that fiscal decentralization formulas are defined properly so that enough resources go to local governments. And this is one of the biggest successes of Ukraine's decentralization. They put their money where their mouth is. They gave responsibility to the gramadas when they amalgamated, and then they gave them resources. We think this has been a big recipe, and many observe this, for the resilience of Ukrainian local governments in response to this conflict. So we believe that there's other work that needs to be done so that this process doesn't get reversed. Anyway, I'll come back to that. We've also been working at the local level, as I said, with the administrative service provision through ULEAD, but also our own Swedish finance project, where we supported over 500 administrative service centers to be developed or modernized to be able to provide like one-stop shop services to communities. Now, recently, we've been talking, as I said, about a change in the program. And of course, we've looked at providing material support, and we've done that in some locations, IT equipment, vehicles, other aspects. But now we're looking at the recovery focus and even Swedish municipal partnerships. And I want to mention 2 upcoming events for you that may be of interest. There is an event happening in Lviv at the end of this month, the Lviv Urban Forum. And you may have heard about it, you may have not, but we can point you to that online. That will be many, many different speakers talking about the recovery and reconstruction and how to do the urban planning approach correctly there, looking at EU integration, preparations, etc. Also, in the 19th to 20th of June, we will have an event in Stockholm for a forum of partnership between Swedish and Ukrainian municipalities. And this is a first step, we hope, to try and convince the Swedish government to even fund partnerships between our local authorities. Next, it's you.
To say that I'm a bit sorry about the slides because the text has been jumping, I think, as a result of the translation. So, but anyway, as Ryan mentioned before, we are now working on forming a new program based on our experiences and ongoing programs in the country with the addition of an urban recovery component. So what we have done is to work with different local experts, including Alex and his team at Restart, to look into 3 different preparatory studies of the work. One which is related to urban profiling initiatives and how that work can be localized in the context of Ukraine. And just some important perspective of why we think that's a good methodology in terms of this specific case is also because it's a very important first step to inform evidence-based and participatory planning. From the perspective of our role as the association, it's also very much to transferring the power from national to the municipal level and ensure that there is a bottom-up process that can be long-lasting and also linked to improvement of legal frameworks and policy making. It also allows for a more holistic approach where you look into different kind of sector-specific needs, which are not only infrastructural, but also mainly social perspectives. It also integrates a lot of different expertise from different levels, different types of organizations and different parts of society. In a context where it's a very complex and intricate situation and network of actors. And as I mentioned before, it's also very much a help to go beyond reconstruction of physical damages and also look into the human impact of conflict and the situation for potential returnees, working with livelihood opportunities and local economic development. The second preparatory story is to look into the existing planning framework, which Restart had worked together with us on, and also the roles for different levels of governments when it comes to planning and urban development. I will not go through all these, but I know it's a lot of text, but just some important takeaways from those studies is specifically that there is a challenge when it comes to integrated approaches today due to the siloed nature of many institutional structures and processes. So that's also why we see that this holistic approach can really help these processes forward. The access of information is lacking both due to monitoring, analyze, and the structure of data on municipal level. And of course, also the difficulty in a balanced approach, which links both the intermediate needs, but also planning for long-term sustainable development. Next slide. And the third preparatory study has looked into ongoing planning initiatives today and also a bit pre-war in Ukraine to say where a new program actually could fit into other ongoing initiatives to not duplicate or replicate. We could replicate if it's good learnings, but to complement other initiatives, of course, and look into the important collaborations and networks that this project would enhance. And some crucial conclusions from that study is something that we have really worked a lot on, which is linking to participatory and integrated processes, which is very much missing according to this study in the ongoing initiatives. We have some good examples that has been mentioned here today. Another perspective which is quite important, I think, is that rural communities and regional centers need more support on long-term planning. So there has been a strong focus on urban centers, of course. And as I mentioned before, also the social perspective is very much needed to work on and is also missing very much in these ongoing initiatives. As part of this study, the team also did a mapping assessment of the different initiatives, including also an evaluation based on different criteria to see what the outcome of these projects have been. Some important conclusions from this mapping, I think, I can just say that the red points are planning initiative with at least some international partner support. The orange one is without international support, and the polygons are on oblast level. But I think you all can see very much the geographical agglomeration of the initiatives. So it's very much focused on specific areas within the country, but there are also some parts of the country which are very much left out currently of different recovery initiatives. So what we have worked on now is also to look into the first outcomes, or the first formulation of outcomes for a new recovery pilot. And this reflects very much what Ryan also mentioned in the beginning with our domains of change. So to strengthen municipal capacities and framework for inclusive recovery and strategic urban planning, but at the same time improve the municipal resilience, service delivery, and local economic development. And this is a first draft of a methodology for this recovery component. Again, it's a first draft and we will continue to work on it, but we also think it's very good to discuss with you during the upcoming days here. But what we really is looking into is a two-phased approach, which begins with more urgent reconstruction efforts that address maybe specific infrastructure losses, schools, hospital, and roads and housing. And the second phase would focus more on deeper development and resilient perspective, and also the aspect of EU integration, which has also been mentioned very much here today. We will go through the different steps, but just to mention, so urban profiling, as I mentioned, as a part of the pre-studies that we did, we think that's a crucial first step of the methodology. It's area-based, it's community-driven, and it's also aimed to localize the analysis. The second step then, based on that, is the rapid neighborhood planning. So working very locally with neighborhood plans to engage the communities and various actors within that geographic location, working on participatory development planning. And the outcome from that would also be to implement some specific urgent quick win projects, emergency projects, which we'd like to call them. And we see this is very important to achieve within the first one and a half year, to have a quick development. At the same time, simultaneously, maybe not after, but starting a little bit earlier than this image shows, is also the city level perspective, the multidisciplinary and resilient development planning, which can also lead to a framework for long-term recovery development and projects. And then we have, of course, the monitoring and follow-up and lessons learned, which will also be done as a part of the first two steps to learn and to refine the methodology and spread the knowledge. And a very important part for us is also the institutionalization perspective, of course, and the support to municipalities, and make sure that we have the expertise in Ukraine and together with the communities that can also fill a very important role to implement this project, to make sure that this is a more long-term, resilient and sustainable process.
Maybe I can just add before I go on to the next one. I think it's really important that you can demonstrate a proof of concept for what you do. And there are already, I heard, so happy to hear good examples happening on the ground, because what you want to do is be able to do something which isn't just based on legislative drafting in the capital, which Hannah was talking about. How do we do a bottom-up approach? The point of the urban code is it should be underpinned by good experiences of doing this the right way. And so if you have a process, whether it's this way and you have comprehensive recovery programs or comprehensive recovery plans, whatever you end up defining it as, having this approach where you learn from it and feed back into doing it the right way from different local pilots is super important, which is why we're proposing to work in clusters of gramadas in certain locations, because also we can deploy the expertise to support them where they have capacity deficiencies. And the other point on this, we've mentioned at the neighborhood level, of course, we know Ukrainian local authorities look very different from cities to amalgamated territories. And amalgamated territories with dispersed villages, with starostas as your only entry point, is something you need to work with for the local level planning. Aggregating that at the level of the city is super important when you think about building back better environmentally, socially, and other aspects. So this is why we propose these two steps a bit like that. And the quick win projects, I wouldn't call them emergency projects, because you should have a catalytic investment that shows you're going to win something, you're going to demonstrate a proof of concept. People won't be lost waiting to see results from a plan, they'll see it. That's, I think, the main point. Anyway, I'm going to run super fast through some of these steps, otherwise, because I think we'll, yeah. Okay, I refer to Syria sometimes. I'm sorry, but this process was done in Syria by me, so I have lessons from this. But urban profiling, basically, you're trying to do conflict sensitivity analysis. How do I not do harm by understanding data the right way? Data gathering and putting that in terms of damages, in terms of service functionality, in terms of economic analysis, and trying to develop a trajectory for the type of recommendations for recovery, whether it's on service restoration, economic recovery, mobility and access, social cohesion, or returns. So that's there. Next slide, please. Yeah. You can do digital tools. I think Ukraine is problematic right now because there is some resistance to share information publicly for obvious reasons. But this is something we did for Syria, where we had an online tool where you could zoom in on neighborhoods and pick up the level of service functionality across different service areas. You could look at housing and property rights and risks there. You could do a whole range of things, which is a very important platform for programming. Next step. Next, please. Neighborhood and municipal planning. We can just skip through this slide. This is the third biggest city in Syria. We did a process over 1 year, 1.5 years, to go from profiling to participatory neighborhood planning to city level planning to implementation of quick win projects. So it worked in 1.5 years to start to show the process. To be honest, you've got a government in Damascus which isn't your friend, and you're trying to convince them that local level is stronger. So we're working against the system there. In Ukraine, you have much better preconditions, although we do have the conversation about re-centralization in Ukraine and that risk. So very important to show its effective and powerful delivery on the ground. I'm not going to go into that more. I'm not saying this because you presented it, and I've heard that this is one of the best examples, and we put it up there because we want a Ukrainian example. We haven't done it yet, but clearly this has been something that's been done the right way, and we need to look at those examples going forward. Next, please. Implementation. I do want to stay on this for a second if I can go over. It's really important. Next slide, please. So we talk about the methods for financing this. In Syria, we convinced the donor community to do a joint UN program to implement in 4 cities the recovery plans. You can use external financing, next slide please, or you can go to other financing sources. The point is you've got a viable plan with projects that should be implemented through different funding sources, and the local authorities should be able to use that for resource generation. And you want to demonstrate the impact. We should be arguing that central state funding should be channeled under the fiscal decentralization for gramadas that are affected for recovery, but gramadas that are also hosting large number of IDPs so that they can maintain services. The whole discussion we've been having on the personal income tax formula relates to this, of course, because 65% of personal income tax, by the way, in Sweden, we also have the same model, but more than 65% goes to local authorities. And private sector financing, of course. Maybe I think we're coming to the end. Next slide. And I want to, we can skip this just to say due diligence is super important given the risks of corruption and abuse of housing, land, and property rights. You must build in safeguards throughout this, every step from profiling to analysis to the implementation.
Yes, and I think I mentioned this very much also before, but I think for the long-term recovery, what we are proposing is also the multidisciplinary and participatory approach to strategic development. And that looks both into short-term, but also long-term priorities. The way of doing this is also working very much with integrated spatial analysis, also including different actors in the spatial work and in the spatial analysis and development and design work. Working also, of course, with the peer-to-peer support between different contexts and different neighboring municipalities to learn from each other and work together in all intermunicipal cooperation, and also interdepartment cooperation to work more on integrated solution and more long-term perspectives. I think we can skip this. I think we have mentioned a lot of this already. I feel that we need to conclude now. These are some principles that we are working according to, so do no harm. That's also part why the methodology is developed as it is, to ensure that it's localized, to ensure that we are looking into the different social perspective as well as the infrastructural and physical perspective. Building back better politically, economically, socially, environmentally. Looking also into geographic and social equity as much as we can, of course, but that's also why we have also started to look into and map the different ongoing initiatives, municipal and community empowerment, the prioritization of vulnerable groups, women and youth. And as Ryan also mentioned very much before, looking into or have a guiding principle of human rights and protections. And working with urban center, but also surrounding regions as a system, to not leave that out, but also to have the urban-rural linkages, of course, which is highly important, not only looking into the urban spheres. And this is we have started also to map, and also, of course, we have already started to work with different partnerships. We have ongoing partnerships from our previous work already. But this is the potential collaboration of different actors, as we see. As Ryan also mentioned before, we are very open to continue to work and open up these partnerships with different actors, both in Sweden and Ukraine. Do you want to add something on this?
No, maybe just to say that we don't know yet when we will be able to realize this ambition, because we depend on the Swedish government, SIDA, the development agency, to fund this, and they can take time to review our proposal, but we will be submitting our proposal to them by the end of June, before midsummer, actually, so that we can get started as soon as possible. We've been waiting a long time already. We know that we want to engage here. We know that there's good experiences on the ground and the partnership. This is why we mentioned strong Ukrainian partners who we can work with. So thank you very much. Sorry if we went over a bit.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helena and Brian.